You have to constantly be evaluating and monitoring your environment to figure out what matters now.
Welcome to the Smart Talk series, the show for professionals who want strategies, tips, and real talk about all things PR, marketing, and social media. Your host is Melissa Vela-Williamson, an award-winning, accredited, and nationally recognized PR pro and communication thought leader. And now your host, Melissa Vela-Williamson.
Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Smart Talk series. I'm your host, Melissa Vela-Williamson. During the Smart Talk series, we've been sharing real talk about topics related to our theme, and our theme has been communicating in turbulent times. Today, as I'm sitting here talking to you, my friends, it is the later part of April, and it is still quite bumpy out there. We have just been watching as a society things change and move. The George Floyd verdict happened this week, and that had implications for our community, for the way we think about each other, the way we think about accountability, which was a big term I saw come out of the media coverage this week, and how our community wants to view that verdict. And I noticed pros across the country evaluating with each other what should happen that day when the verdict came out. And why I bring that up is when we're thinking through turbulent times, the idea of that is that things are not smooth. And with all the care in the world, I want to point to what happened this week. And that idea of when you are a communicator and you work on content and messaging, when you run social media and you have marketing and promotional stories and messaging that's going out through email and multiple channels, or when you have a public relations campaign, or you're at a press conference, pitching media, either way, you have to constantly be evaluating and monitoring your environment to figure out what matters now. What matters now is important to think about because things have changed so much in the last 14 plus months of this pandemic. And nothing's rang as true as the ability to evaluate and prioritize your work, your needs, your organization, what your stakeholders needs, and what messaging is in harmony with that reality is vital. In episode 2, Crisis Communication Pro Chris Talley shared how being able to assess your mindset and understand that role and vantage point of others is helpful in having tough conversations that are so common in crisis situations. I am a columnist for the Public Relations Society of America, and I write for public relations practitioners across the country. And as part of my work, I wrote a column called The Value of Real Talk, and I unpack there the idea and some of the how-tos around how you communicate when every day it just seems like it's a little more challenging to do so. How do you make people feel valued and included and pick the right words and terms that are continuing to evolve day to day? And what's the most respectful way to define anything, really? You know, I've actually worked in diversity and inclusion. I worked in an office of D&I for over 4 years at a major corporation with over thousands and thousands of employees from all types of backgrounds and viewpoints. And I can tell you, even in that window of time, the lexicon of acceptable terms and how we phrase things and the approach with that vocabulary changed a lot. And since then, it's changed even more. And I think what it comes down to is when times are tough is being thoughtful, strategic, and a little more slowly deliberate in your movements is a good step forward. But what was really clear then and is even more clear now is that having real talk conversations that are uncomfortable but help bring clarity to an issue and enable real connections with each other has really great value. So how do you have difficult conversations? How do you have that real talk, particularly in the workplace or with clients or others you work with and you don't have real personal relationships with? In episode 3, our local Meals on Wheels spoke about how unifying it can be when your entire community is actually in crisis. It opened the doors to a mutual understanding for their clients, a very vulnerable population. During the pandemic, so many more individuals could finally understand what it means to be homebound, lacking resources, and the toll isolation can take. When you can empathize with others, you can better communicate with them, which is a great way to have real talk and facilitate conversations that are necessary to bring about positive change and deeper connections. So how do you have that real talk and facilitate the conversations that are necessary to bring about positive change and bring about deeper connections, particularly in the workplace? That is very tricky, my friends. It's very tricky when the wrong term, tone, or timing can turn what should be positive into a negative. And it's important that we have an amount of psychological safety within our workplace environments, within our relationships, so that we can ask the questions that, for the most part, are probably innocent. Really being curious goes along with the ability to ask a question without being shut down or canceled. And so I want us as communication professionals to evaluate our points of view, how we react to each other. If we're facilitating and advocating for a development of a psychologically safe workplace and a psychologically safe environment, both with our colleagues and within our own families, that's important because everything that's been happening in our community, when you unpack it, ultimately it just leads to more questions. And questions should be a welcome part of Real Talk. In episode 4, emergency management professional Michael Moreland pointed out how valuable open conversations with stakeholders were during the planning process, and how that candid communication process turns out to be more valuable than any actual plan itself. So, for example, in my diversity and inclusion work, and each month in a diversity program would open up opportunities to celebrate a different culture or background. And each program that I would create and then communicate was chosen with a lot of care. And it was really important to take a couple steps to have conversations and programming that would attract an audience, of course, that's always important, but also engage them in a way that was safe for everyone involved. And when we're working on behalf of an organization or a client, we have to evaluate and take that into consideration. While we may want to be strong advocates and talk about issues, we have to do that in a way that doesn't have or create more damage. So I want to share a couple tips I have on how to have the difficult conversations and how to create that psychological safety that'll help us continue to grow as communication professionals, but as a society as well. And the more that we do that for our organizations, the better our outcomes will be, because happy employees make good products, give good service. And that is always important to the work we do as communication pros. We can't market something well that's not working. And in public relations, we can't build good relationships if we have unhappy employees that are grumpy with our customers, and we have customers who are upset because they're not being served well. And particularly in nonprofits and those who do a lot of trust work, where you are going into people's homes, you are crossing their threshold, you are seeing them at some of their worst moments, that safety and trust across each side is very important. So here are some of the tips I have to have those difficult conversations that bring about great change. The first is to take caution when you have real talk. Earning trust takes time. And if you're new, for example, at an organization, jumping out there and saying, I want to have this really tricky conversation right out the gate may not be very settling for your supervisor. If you have a pattern of accountability as a professional and your organization has a pattern of being there, being reliable and accountable, and doing good work on behalf of the community, particularly on these causes that you want to explore, it's going to be so much more authentic and warmly received and circled with that trust factor. When you have real talk, I think it's really important to understand that employees and those around you will probably be really interested in what that conversation could be like. When I created programming for employees through the diversity and inclusion department, we had these lunch and learn topics, and they always went well beyond the typical diversity month celebrations. One program that I held that was popular and interactive was about cultural issues in the workplace. And years ago, that wasn't very common. I did include the help of an academic researcher, which is another tip I would say is when you're going to have real talk, make sure it's not just from your point of view in which you're sharing viewpoints. Point to the data. There's a lot of great sources like Pew Research Center that has information on what a large majority of Americans say about one issue or another. And so that way you're not talking from your own paradigm that may have biases that you're not even conscious about. So when I had a program about cultural issues in the workplace, that was really back then exploring some of the isms that all of us face, right? Whether within a community, that could be, for example, like in the Hispanic Latino community, that could be colorism. Of course, we know about sexism, but all these isms and the different ways and places we feel othered can really influence how we communicate, whether we're open or defensive in our behaviors and verbals as well as nonverbals in the workplace. So during the program, we reviewed techniques on how to develop what are some more appropriate responses that we can consciously think about and override our subconscious system and that we may use and be defensive in uncomfortable situations. When we had that Q&A, I was really inspired by the employees. They were so passionate about sharing just different stories they had of microaggressions, those little bitty slights that we experience in our life that made them feel a little less than in the workplace that can often lead to imposter syndrome. And, we have experiences as children that may come with us into the workplace. So unpacking that baggage and laying it on the table, kind of sharing our shared experiences around some of these little slights really helped us connect as people. It was interesting to have that discourse. And I felt really, really excited about the connections that were being made where people from different parts of a company, different cultures and backgrounds, different education levels and stances on all kinds of issues were relating to each other in their shared experience of, having been othered in some way. I think we also came to understanding that in other ways, there are times where what we're going through, that adversity really gives us an advantage. And just having that paradigm shift came from the discourse. In episode 5, internal communicator Amanda Todd also underlined the need to create a space that's psychologically safe, so employees can have conversations that are extremely tough and usually don't really happen inside the workplace. So when you do have that real talk, if you back it up with data so that people know it's more than just what you have to say or what you think are your lived experiences, that helps neutralize some of the topics in those conversations. But having that outside voice, for example, in that situation, the academic researcher, or at least that outside, data source can help also make something that may feel a little uncomfortable, polarizing, a little more digestible. And having real talk is about thinking through, well, how can we make this feel a little less awkward, a little better, and find that common bridge that we can walk across together with. But really, during that discourse, the shares were respectful. And when you start real talk, if you do it with that first moderator, that first MC, the materials are sensitively written and it's talking about that, this is going to be a great sharing of information. And if you have that spirit all the way through, people will still be respectful and careful about being sensitive and what they have to say and what they have to share. So during that program, the shares were very candid, but they were very well said, and we didn't cross any boundaries or lines or point fingers at anyone to say that anyone in particular at a workplace had done something wrong or made us feel bad. But even still back then, I was asked after the program, I was asked by someone in a different department to explain what happened in that discussion. I heard that it was very passionate, and real talk can be very passionate, and that can make some people nervous. That can make those in our human resources department nervous. That can make, our supervisors nervous. But what they saw come out of that was a lot more employees with agency, feeling like they could ask some questions or share an experience. And I think that surprised us years ago. And today, particularly through these turbulent times, what I've seen as we're restoring our communities is more people feeling like they have that right to ask questions, make conversation, and be curious about, well, why are we always doing something this way or that way? And while that may be uncomfortable, those first steps forward through having these real talk conversations and finding out about others and what are our challenges and really acknowledging and talking with the elephant in the room is very helpful for us to move forward and continue to grow and restore and recover from everything we've been through the last year or so, right? So remembering that everyone at different times can feel othered in certain situations and discussing that shared reality is really helpful when you're going into those types of conversations. Some other steps you can take, and another tip would be, really acknowledging and understanding employees are going to want to have real talk and see real change. They want to go deeper on a number of issues. They want to break down systemic racism. They want to talk about the otherisms and, all the isms that plague our workplace. And some of the other tips around that would be to work with a trained diversity, inclusion, and equity professional or a researcher, or at least gather data and research that you can share and present and walk people through so that you have the insights and you can facilitate more productive conversations. Some of the best research you can provide and the insights that you'll gain are from those closest to your organization and those closest to the topic and the cause and the initiative you want to learn about or get involved with. If you need to create anything from scratch, there's so many resources online, and there's so many committees and councils and boards and nonprofits that you can learn from and get involved with. Another tip for taking the steps to having real talk is don't make any decisions alone or in a silo. Even with large organizations, sometimes one particular department makes a decision or puts together a program and didn't get any feedback from the others that may have expertise in that space, may have different connections and resources. You definitely want to discuss the topics and program details around any of these real talk or diversity, inclusion, equity conversations. Anything that might make good change but might be a little bit uncomfortable. There are employee resource groups. You have diversity committees, volunteer councils, external pros, consultants. Don't go alone on this journey. You never want to, put yourself into that situation where it's only from your own resources you make these decisions. You can always create a program. You can always have a conversation or facilitate a town hall, or even the messaging we create around some of these tricky subjects. You can work with professionals outside your organization so that you don't encounter any blind spots in what you're putting out. Or if you're an agency, you definitely want to get that client buy-in to have these type of conversations or have this type of messaging or decide when you want to take a stand on certain issues. Involve your leadership in planning or the programming from the beginning as possible, or at least do those check-ins and get that buy-in from the ground up so that you're planning and building together, because we all know without that top leader or client approval and buy-in, a lot of these great ideas don't come to life. You'll need their support to take on these issues or any of the actions that need to be addressed in your organization. And you'll want them championing the initiative from the beginning. And the day you're to launch or the day you're to have your event, then they're being involved and beside you on that journey. That's going to be very effective, and that feels very authentic for those who want to participate, those employees or even the constituents or clients of an organization. They want to see that leadership acknowledgement, and they be authentically in support of that initiative. And lastly, the reality of this work is that doing this work can be very heavy, and you may need to really uncover and think through and evaluate some of your own unconscious biases. You may need to look within your organization before you take any moves forward and say, we need to fix this area. We need to fix this process. I've understood this gap in our system before you do have any kind of program or any kind of town hall or messaging externally where you talk about something that is a change for everyone. It will take courage to have that real talk and acknowledge the isms that exist in the workplace. It will take courage to have that conversation and address issues that are out there. But our employees, which for all organizations are our most vital stakeholders, or those closest to our organizations, will benefit in the long run. Thank you for joining me for the final episode of Season 1 of the Smart Talk series. Before you log off, be sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss when our next season rolls out. If you haven't had a chance yet, be sure to check out our new PR Pro Gear Shop at prgearshop.com. For years, I couldn't find any cool communication or PR swag online or at conferences even. So we made some of our own. Check out prgearshop.com for promo gear designed by industry pros for industry pros. And as always, think smart and communicate smart. And I'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Smart Talk series. If you learned something or enjoyed our conversation, share it on social media or send to a friend. To learn more about this and other communication topics, visit mvw360.com. That's mvw360.com.